We continue now at the top of Daf Kuftes Vav Amud Aleph Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 115a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing the halach in the Mishnah. Let's say you have karbonos where it's not the proper time, it's mechusar zman. The person is not supposed to bring this carbon yet, and he brings that carbon, he offers up that carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash at that time, again when it's mechusar zman. So the general rule is that if the individual is potter in terms of shchutei chutz in that situation, since it wouldn't have been accepted inside the Beis HaMikdash, so therefore there's no liability outside of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Mishnah discusses cases like a zav, a mitzorah. They have certain karbonos like chatas and asham that they have to bring, and if it's mechusar zman, if it's not the right time, and they bring those outside of the Beis HaMikdash, then the person is exempt. The Mishnah contrasted that with an olah or shlamim, since an olah and shlamim in general can be brought for them on their behalf as an adav, as a voluntary offering. So if they bring the olah or shlamim outside of the Beis HaMikdash, they would be liable. And on the previous Amud, the Gemara said that Rav Chilkiah holds, let's say by carbon asham, let's say the person would bring the carbon asham mechusar zman, not at the proper time, but he would bring it shelo lishmo, he'd bring it not for its sake. So the halacha is, by a carbon asham, if it's brought not for its sake, it's considered to be a kosher carbon. It doesn't satisfy the obligation of the owner, but it is considered to be a kosher carbon. And so let's say he brought it not as a carbon asham, he brought it, for example, as a carbon olah. That would be an example of shelo lishmo. So then there would be liability. And that, of course, is based on the assumption that, again, if that carbon asham would be brought inside the Beis HaMikdash shelo lishmo, then it would be accepted. And on that, Rav Huna asked, this halacha that shelo lishmo is an acceptable carbon, that's only true if the carbon would have been brought lishmo, it would have been kosher. So then we say, even shelo lishmo is also accepted. But in this case, this carbon asham that we're talking about, it's mechusar zman, it would not be accepted lishmo inside the Beis HaMikdash, so it should not be accepted shelo lishmo as well. Do we ever find a situation where something is not accepted lishmo and it is accepted shelo lishmo? That was the question of Rav Huna. And the Gemara continues and says we actually do find such an example. In the following example, Pesach b'shar yemos hashana, let's say a carbon Pesach is brought not at the proper time, de'eino kosher lishmo, it certainly cannot be brought at that time as a carbon Pesach, v'kosher shelo lishmo, but it can be brought shelo lishmo because it counts as a carbon shlamim. And the Gemara says to that, that's not a good proof. Pesach b'shar yemos hashana, shlamim ninu, a carbon Pesach during the rest of the year is automatically a shlamim, and therefore it's understood that that would be kosher. Rashi explains, Pesach b'shar yemos hashana eino kosher lishmo. A Pesach, again, throughout the year, not at the proper time, is not going to be kosher lishmo. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, shachtu kodem chatzos pasol, shenemar ben harbayim. If it's slaughtered before chatzos, it's pasol. So, of course, again, it's not the proper time, it's disqualified. But if it's shelo lishmo, then again, it seems to be kosher. But the Gemara answered that shlamim, if it's actually during the rest of the year, it actually is a shlamim. Ve'ein ze'el lishmo, and this actually would be considered lishmo, and so that's not a good proof against Rav Huna's argument. And the Gemara continues, Lema Messiah, let's say the following brisa supports Rav Chilkiah. Again, Rav Chilkiah is saying that in Asham Shelo Lishmo, let's say it's not the proper time, but it's brought Shelo Lishmo outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so there would be liability in that case because it can be brought inside the Beis HaMikdash Shelo Lishmo. And the brisa says, Yachol Shani Motzi Af Ola Mechusar Zman B'Bailim. One might think that I exclude even the case of a carbon Ola, which is Mechusar Zman. The owners are not supposed to be bringing it yet. V'Yasham Nazir, V'Yasham Mitzorah, carbon Asham of a Nazir, a carbon asham of a mitzorah that have disqualifications. One might think we should exclude that from liability. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Shor mikol makom, Kesev mikol makom, Eiz mikol makom. These are extra words in the psukim, so it says Shor, it means in any situation, Kesev in any situation, Eiz in any situation. The full pasuk is Ish mi beis Yisrael, Asher yishchat, Shor o Kesev o Eiz b'machana, o Asher yishchat michutz lamachana. And the Gemara understands that the pasuk didn't need to mention all the various animals, and so therefore these are inclusions. And we say, therefore, that these cases are not excluded. Rashi explains, Lema Messiah Leila Rav Chilkiah. Again, this price is a support for Rav Chilkiah. Yachol Shani Motzi Me El Pesach. One might think that I should exclude from the pasuk of El Pesach Shelo Yischayev B'chutz, that one should not be chayev if he offers these up outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Al Ola Mechusar Zman B'Bailim, for example, a carbon Ola that's Mechusar Zman. It's not yet the time for the Bailim to bring that carbon. Kagon Shal Yoledes U'Mitzorah, for example, it is an Ola Havdalah of a Yoledis or a Mitzora, a woman who gives birth, or a Mitzora, Hoel Ve'ena Ru'uya Lavo Lifnim Lemitzvasa, because right now it's not the proper time. It can't be brought inside the Beis HaMikdash, so maybe there's no liability. Outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and Rashi continues, V'yasham Nazir, V'yasham Mitzora, the Yasham of a Nazir and of a Mitzora, Sheyesh B'Psul, that there's some kind of disqualification, U'Lakamei Meforish V'Azal Mai Psula, and the Gemara will explain what exactly is the disqualification we're talking about. And so Rashi continues, the Gemara says, Shor Mikol Makam, the word Shor is an inclusion. Demotzi L'meimar Asher Yishchat B'Machana, O Asher Yishchat Michutz L'Machana V'Yal Pesach. It could have just said that it slaughtered, it did not need to identify the animals. V'ano Yodana Deshor O Kesav O Ezu, I know that it's either going to be an ox or a sheep or a goat. And so the Gemara continues and says, V'ilu chatas shaira. Now what's left out of this brisa is carbon chatas. In other words, the brisa must be talking about a scenario where the ola mechusar zman and the yasham nazir, the yasham mitzora, they are included in the prohibition of shchutei chutz, and for some reason chatas is not included. And so we have to identify the scenario. The Gemara says, B'may askin, and what exactly is the case in this brisa? Ilema bismano, if you're going to say that we're talking about where the yasham nazir and the yasham mitzora, it's bismano, it is the proper time. So if it's bismano, so my ir yasham, why only talk about an asham? If it's the proper time, it would be accepted in the Beis HaMikdash. It's obvious there should be liability outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and afilu chatas nami, that would be true even by a carbon chatas. It's not only by asham nazir and asham mitzora. If we're including asham nazir and asham mitzora in the proper time, certainly we would include chatas in the proper time as well. Ela shalo lizmano, rather you have to say that we're talking shalo bismano, it is not at the proper time. Uvemai, so what exactly is the scenario? Ilema lishmo, if you're going to say that the person offered it up outside of the Beis HaMikdash lishmo as the carbon that it actually is, he offered the asham nazir, for example, as an asham. So if that's the case, asham amai chayiv, but why would he be chayiv on the carbon asham? It's not the proper time. It wouldn't be accepted lishmo in the Beis HaMikdash, so there's no liability outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Elalav, rather, is it not shalo lishmo? We're talking about shalo lishmo. In other words, we're talking about shalo bismano. It's not the proper time, and it's saying exactly what Rav Chilkiah said, that when you have a carbon asham shalo lishmo and it's not the proper time, there is liability because that would be accepted inside of the Beis HaMikdash, and that's not true by carbon chatas because shalo lishmo is not accepted as a carbon. And the Gemara continues and says, Liolam bismano v'shalo lishmo. Really, the Bryce is talking about in the proper time, and it's actually talking about shalo lishmo. In other words, we're talking about a situation where really the carbon asham is supposed to be brought at this time, and the person slaughters it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. The question on that was, then it should be true by carbon chatas as well, if it's the proper time, and you're slaughtering it outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So of course there's liability, because it would have been accepted in the Beis HaMikdash. But the Gemara says we're talking about shalo lishmo. It was offered up outside of the Beis HaMikdash, not as a carbon asham. It was shalo lishmo, as we said by carbon asham in general. We usually say that shalo lishmo is kosher, so again, of course, there would be liability. But here we're saying it's following the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. We're following the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Diamar makshinon asham lachatas. Rabbi Eliezer holds that we compare asham to chatas, and shalo lishmo is actually not allowed inside of the Beis HaMikdash by a carbon asham, just like a carbon chatas. V'tana tafel v'hu adin ikar, and the Tana is teaching us the tafel, the derivative case asham, is learned from chatas, and the same actually would be true by the ikr, by the main case, which is carbon chatas. And in other words, what the Gemara is now saying is that we're talking about bismano, it's the proper time, and it's being offered up shalo lishmo outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and there's liability by the asham, and that also would be true by the chatas, there would be liability. And even though shalo lishmo is not accepted in the Beis HaMikdash, so one might think there's no liability outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but since it's the proper time and it could just be offered up stam in the Beis HaMikdash, not saying anything, and it would be accepted, and so therefore even shalo lishmo outside of the Beis HaMikdash, both by asham and by chatas, in fact, will have liability. And Rashi explains, Inema bismano v'lishmo, if you're going to say the Bryce is talking about in the proper time and it's being brought as the carbon asham, so ma'ir yasham, why say that asham is liable? The ravya, chatas nami mechayiv. The same should be true by chatas, it also, there should be a liability there. The lo boy ribuya v'afilu asham, da chazi bifnim. In both of these cases, it's chazi bifnim, and so it should be true by both. Ela shalo bismano ravya l'chiyuv b'asham. Rather, we're talking it's not the proper time, and there's a liability by asham. Now, ilishmo asham amachayiv. Now, if the person brought it it as the Karban Asham, and again, it's not the proper time, why would there be liability? If it's not kosher to be brought inside the mikdash, and we said that it's exempt in this case. And if you're going to say, well, since in theory you could bring it shelo l'shmo b'fnim, hamachusar akira, that's lacking in uprooting. You'd have to uproot it from its name in order to bring it inside. V'kulu modubo. Everybody agrees. We said this on the previous summer that that's not going to create a liability. Elalav shelo l'shmo. Rather, the case must be again it's shelo bismano and it's being brought outside of the Beis Hamikdash shelo l'shmo and ravi l'chiyuva b'chutz Rav Chilkiah. We're including that there's going to be a liability outside the Beis Hamikdash, just like Rav Chilkiah. That's why the Brisa initially is a support for Rav Chilkiah. Alma davar sheino kasher l'shmo b'fnim. You see that's something that cannot be brought l'shmo b'fnim because it's not the proper time, but kasher l'shelo l'shmo. It is kasher shelo l'shmo b'fnim u'mechayev aleh shelo l'shmo b'chutz, and there's liability if it's shelo l'shmo b'chutz. And then the Gemara said, Hachi garsinan liolam bismano v'sulo, the proper text. Really, it is bismano, it's at the proper time. Umemela ashalo lishmo dukim nakoy, and we're going on the case of shalo lishmo, and we're saying there's liability. And Rashi explains, Zela kamashani liolam bismano v'shalo lishmo. The Gemara now is saying that it's again at the proper time in shalo lishmo. V'itzrich l'rebuya, and that needs to be included mishum to shalo lishmo pasalu, because actually, according to the Tana of this brisa, shalo lishmo really is disqualified in the mikdash. Rabbi Eliezer, and the Brisa is following Rabbi Eliezer, Demakish Asham Lechatos, Demifsal B'Shalo Lishmo B'Fnim B'Ashamos. He says Asham is compared to Chatos. It's also Pasal Shalo Lishmo B'Fnim. Diafilu Achi Mechayev Ala B'Chutz. And nevertheless, even though Shalo Lishmo B'Fnim is not going to be accepted, but there's still liability by Chutz Shalo Lishmo. Afagav Do'akar Mine Shem Asham. Even though he's uprooted from it, the name of the Asham, he's doing it Shalo Lishmo. Akati, but still, you have a Ma'ayel Le Lifnim, have a Kosher Lemishchet Stama. If he would bring it in the mikdash and he would slaughter it stam without designating it as anything, the kosher l'shem ola, and it would be kosher l'shem ola v'ola l'shem choven, and would satisfy the obligation. Demishum dibure lo mi'aker shmei minei, because of his dibur, because of his speech, that doesn't uproot its name. V'chol kamad lo shachta le bi kara koi stama l'shmo. There's a general rule that stam is considered l'shmo. Hilkach ki shachid le roy lifnim l'shmo haya. Therefore, at the time that he's slaughtering it, it is considered fit to go inside the Beis Hamikdash l'shmo. V'hu adin da'achatas shelo l'shmo nami chayiv. And the same would actually be true by chatas shelo l'shmo. Again, outside, in a situation where it is the proper time and it's done outside of the Beis Hamikdash shelo l'shmo, there would be liability there. Elatona tafel ve'ashmin an afagav d'chi agav nepasel b'fnim mechayiv ala b'chutz. Rather, the Brisa is just teaching us the derivative case and saying even though it's disqualified to be shelo l'shmo inside the mikdash, still there's liability outside. V'hu adin et leikar, and the same is true by the main case, which is chatas. Demai shno, why should they be different? Sof tarvayu psili shelo l'shmon. At the end of the day, both of them are disqualified shelo l'shmon. Uv'toras kohanim kotani babehedya shelo l'shmo. In the Toras Kohanim, it actually says explicitly we're talking about shelo l'shmo. V'al karchach muki lo Rabbi Eliezer, and you have to say that it's following Rabbi Eliezer. The ilo l'rabbonon, because if we're following the rabbonon that shelo l'shmo is actually accepted, lo itzrich le l'rebuya, you don't even need to include it. To haki hagavna miskabelas b'fnimi, because then it's accepted inside the mikdash, and so there's nothing to talk about. It's obvious. It would be too obvious, and therefore you have to say it's Rabbi Eliezer. There is a bit of a chiddush here, and again, the idea is we're teaching the derivative case, and the same is true by Karban Chatas as well. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof. The Brisa says, Yachol shani marba ola mechusar zman begufa, v'chatos bein begufa bein bebailam. One might think I should include in liability, let's say you have an ola that's mechusar zman, the animal itself is not yet ready to be brought, or you have a Karban Chatas that's mechusar zman either by the animal itself or the owner is not yet ready to bring the Karban Chatas. One might think there should be liability in these cases. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, V'el Pesach Ol Moed, it says to the entrance of the Ol Moed, and again, Kol sheino roy lavo bepesach Ol Moed. If it's not fit to be brought, here it's mechusar zman, so it's not fit to be brought to the entrance of the Ol Moed, ein chayav and alein, so then there's no liability. And again, the Gemara says, Vilu Asham Shaira. Now, in terms of Asham, why is that not mentioned? That same case could be mentioned in the Brisa. And so the Gemara says, why should it be again that Asham should be left out? But my askin on what exactly is the case? Ilema lishmo, if we're talking about mechusar zman and it's brought lishmo, so Asham nami lifterei. So again, if it's lishmo, that's not accepted. If it's mechusar zman in the mikdash, so it should be exempt outside outside, asham should be included in the brisa. Elolav shelo lishmo, rather, aren't we talking about a case where it is mechusar zman and it's shelo lishmo, and by asham there would be liability, because again, by carbon asham, we would say that would be accepted in contrast to carbon chatas, and that would be a support for Rav Chilkiah. And the Gemara says, Liolam, really, shelo lishmo for Rabbi Eliezer. Really, we can say we're talking about shelo lishmo, and it actually is Rabbi Eliezer, the makish asham lachatas, who says that we compare carbon asham to carbon chatas, and Tana Ikar in this case, the Tana teaches us the main case, the kol shekain latafel, and certainly it would be true by the derivative case. And Rashi explains, Ela shelo lishmo. Initially, the Gemara says the Bryce is talking about shelo lishmo, mechusar zman shelo lishmo, hilka chatas potter, therefore chatas is exempt, the lochazi lifnim, because again, that cannot be brought shelo lishmo lifnim, it cannot be brought inside the Beis HaMikdash, shelo lishmo. V'yasham chayv, and then asham, there would be liability, the chazi lifnim, as we said, shelo lishmo is going to be accepted, v'yafagav de'ein roy lishmo, even though in this case, you couldn't bring it lishmo because it's mechusar zman, but shelo lishmo would still be accepted, v'hainu Rav Chilkiah, and that follows Rav Chilkiah, udelo Rav Huna, not like Rav Huna. Hachigarsin on Hamani Rabbi Eliezer. Then the Gemara answered that really this brisa again is Rabbi Eliezer. V'lo garsin on liolam b'lishmo. Now do not have the text that we're talking about lishmo, even within the answer in the brisa that this is Rabbi Eliezer. It's still shelo lishmo. And Rashi continues and explains, Hamani Rabbi Eliezer, he kolomer, what the Gemara means to say is, Vadai b'shalo lishmo hi kitaka amrit. We certainly are talking about shalo lishmo, like you said. Hilka chatas potter, therefore by carbon chatas, again, shalo lishmo, there's going to be an exemption, de lo chazi b'fnim, because you can't bring it inside. Lo b'lishmo v'lo b'shalo lishmo, you can't bring it inside in any fashion, not lishmo or shalo lishmo, de mechusar zmanu, because again, it is mechusar zman, that's the case of the Bryce over here. V'yasham nami potter, and when it comes to the yasham as well, we say exempt to lo chazi lifnim lishmo, because it's not fit to be brought lishmo lifnim b'mechusar zman, because it's mechusar zman. V'lo l'shalo lishmo, and it's also not fit to be shalo lishmo. De Rabbi Eliezer ka'amar de pasil ba'asham shalo lishmo, because we're following Rabbi Eliezer, who says that asham shalo lishmo is actually disqualified. But then the question is, if asham and chatas are identical in this brisa, why is asham left out of the brisa? Asham should have said as well that there's no liability. And the answer to that is v'hai d'shayrei li asham. The reason why the brisa left out asham, lav desvirle dechayv, it's not because by asham there's liability. Elakevan dechad taimahu, since it's all the same reason according to Rabbi Eliezer. Mishum de tarvayu psulin shalo lishmo bifnimhu, because they're both disqualified if it's shalo lishmo bifnim. So tana ikar chatas de potter, so we just teach the case of chatas, which is the main case of shalo lishmo, and that case is exempt. V'kol shekain tafel asham, and certainly by the derivative case of asham. And Rashi notes, v'hai kol shekain gimgum, the truth is it's not really a kol shekain, it's not really a kal v'chomer over here technically. V'dochke de Rav Huna lo ukma Rabbi Eliezer. Now the reason why Rav Huna said that you have to say this is like Rabbi Eliezer, misham seifa, it's because the end of the brisa, dal korchach Rabbi Eliezer misukma, we already said this is the same brisa as quoted above. We just said above that has to be like Rabbi Eliezer, kidefarish nalel, like I explained earlier. V'yod, and further, misham del rabbanon lo yalfinan asham mechatas, according to the rabbanon who don't learn asham from chatas, leko lemeimar tana hai v'hu adin lahai. You can't say we taught chatas in the same by asham because there's no derivative situation over here. V'yafal gav del rabbanon nami kamar de potter. Now, even though according to the rabbanon, just like Rabbi Eliezer, the individual would be exempt if he brings it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, that would be true by the chatas and the asham, because we're talking about a situation of mechusar zman. There's nothing that's not kosher lishmo, meaning in terms of lishmo, the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer don't even have a dispute on that. The kosher shelo lishmo, and in terms of shelo lishmo, that it should be kosher, lo matzi lo ukma k'Rabbanan, that you can say is following the Rabbanan, dim kain, nashminan asham de potter, the nishminan batarti, v'kol shekain chatas. Then you might as well teach us the brisa shouldn't leave out asham. According to the Rabbanan, the brisa should have actually taught it by the carbon asham and say that there's an exemption by the carbon asham in this case. Even though in general shelo lishmo is kosher according to the Rabbanan, but again over here, since it's mechusar zman, we're going to say there's no liability, and then certainly that would be true by chatas, where shelo lishmo in general is not going to be kosher, it's not going to be accepted. There is not going to be a liability, and so therefore you can't answer that the brisa is the Rabbanan. You have to answer that the brisa is Rabbi Eliezer. That way we can say that Tana Ikar, the brisa, is teaching the main case. It's teaching that chatas is exempt, and the same is going to be true by the tafel, by the carbon asham. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, the following proof. T'chiyasur Rav Dimi Amar, when Rav Dimi came, he said, Tana devei Rabbi Levoy, it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Levoy, Yochol shani motzi af olas mechusar zman bebailim, one might think I should exclude from liability the ola that's mechusar zman, again, that it's not yet the proper time, because the owners are not supposed to bring it, and Asham Nazir v'Asham Mitzora, the Asham Nazir and the Asham Mitzora also that are disqualified, one might think we should exclude that from liability. And the Gemara interrupts and says, My Talmud, what exactly is the derivation? The Brisa is saying one might think to exclude it. Well, what's the inclusion? And the Gemara says that's the same as the Brisa above. Amar Ravina says, Shor mikol makom, kesev mikol makom, eiz mikol makom. It's talking about, it says in the pasuk, shor, kesev, eiz, those are extra words as we said, and therefore these are inclusions, and therefore we include, again, the exact same case the Brisa brought above, of ola mechusar zman bebailim, and asham nazir, and asham mitzora, and we're saying in these cases that there is liability if they're offered outside of the Beis HaMikdash, and the Gemara now is assuming that this should be a proof to Rav Chilkiah. The case must be that we're talking about Mechusar Zman, it's not the proper time. Those are the disqualifications by Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora as well, just like by the Karban Ola, and it's not the proper time, and it must be that it's Shelo Lishmo, and since it's being offered up, Shelo Lishmo, that's why there is liability, since it would be accepted Shelo Lishmo, even though it wouldn't be accepted Lishmo, because it's Mechusar Zman, but like Rav Chilkiah said, Shelo Lishmo would be accepted Bifnim, and therefore there's liability by chutz. The Gemara is bringing essentially the same proof as above, and that's why the Gemara says, Hamai Rumya, what kind of question is this? Kida Amrit, it should be just like we said above. Again, the Gemara answered above that the way we can answer this brisa is we are not talking about Rav Chilkiah's scenario. Rather, we are talking about where it is bismano, it is the proper time, and there's a different disqualification, and that disqualification is that it's shelo lishmo, and we're following Rabbi Eliezer. And in such a situation, we say, even though Shelo Lishmo is disqualified, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and even though that's true by Chatas as well, because the two are compared, but still, nevertheless, since it's the proper time, if it's brought outside the Beis HaMikdash, there is liability, because it can be brought stam within the Beis HaMikdash, and it will be accepted. Again, that's the Gemara's answer that was above, and that same answer should apply to this brisa, which is identical. And so the question is, why are we even bringing an identical brisa as a support for Rav Chilkiah? And the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rav Nachman says, Mishum Durami Detana Devei Rav Levoy Adatani Levi. The reason why we're bringing this brisa, this version, is because there was a contradiction between this brisa and that which was taught by Levi. Because Levi taught the following brisa: Asham Nazir v'Asham Mitzora. It says you have an Asham Nazir and an Asham Mitzora. Sheshachtan Shelo Lishman Kasher, and if they're slaughtered Shelo Lishma, they are kosher. V'lo alu l'bailim l'shem chova, but they don't satisfy the obligation of the owner. That's the general halacha when it comes to Karban Asham. And Shachton Mechusar Zman Bebailim, if they're slaughtered and it's not yet the proper time, it's outside of the proper time. O Shahayu B'nei Shtei Shanim, or let's say they're 2 years old, not the proper age. V'Shachton, and he slaughters them psulin, so then we say that they are disqualified. And what is clear is that this particular brisa is certainly talking about Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora that are Mechusar Zman, and it's saying that in this case of Mechusar Zman, if it's slaughtered, that it's disqualified, and that is a contradiction to the above brisa that's talking about Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora, that is talking about the fact that there is liability, that implies that there's no disqualification. Umeshani Rav Dimi, and Rav Dimi answered this contradiction by saying, Lokash, it's not difficult, kan lishmo, kan shalo lishmo. One brisa is talking about lishmo, and one brisa is talking about shalo lishmo. And the idea, according to Rav Dimi, is that the brisa which says psulin, which says disqualified by Mechusar Zman, and therefore if it would be outside the Beis HaMikdash, we would say that there's no liability. That's talking about where it's lishmo, it's talking about a regular case of Mechusar Zman. You have a Karban Asham that's Mechusar Zman, it's not going to be accepted inside the Beis HaMikdash, and if it is slaughtered lishmo outside of the Beis HaMikdash, so then we say that there is no liability. That's that brisa. And the earlier brisa, according to this approach, is also talking about Mechusar Zman, when it says Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora are included, and there is liability. There it's talking about Mechusar Zman, but it's talking about Shelo Lishmo, and as Rav Chilkiah said, Shelo Lishmo there's going to be liability because it's accepted Shelo Lishmo Bifnim, and therefore this approach of Rav Dimi in this brisa would support Rav Chilkiah. And the Gemara continues, Rav Ashi Rami Masnisan Brisa. Rav Ashi had the same contradiction between our Mishnah and the Brisa. Again, our Mishnah says by the Karban Asham that's Mechusar Zman, if it's offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, there's no liability. The Brisa said that there is liability. Umeshani, and he gave the same answer as Rav Dimi, Kan Lishmo, V'Chan Shelo Lishmo. In one case Lishmo, one case not Lishmo. Again, exactly like Rav Chilkiah, that in the case of an Asham that's Mechusar Zman, Shelo Lishmo, there is liability outside the Beis HaMikdash because it's accepted inside the Beis HaMikdash. And so the Gemara says, Lema Tavi Tiyuvte de Rav Huna, let us say that all of these approaches, Rav Dimi's approach in resolving the contradiction in the Brisas, and again Rav Ashi's approach in resolving the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa, essentially they all refute Rav Huna, because they're all assuming that all of these cases are Mechusar Zman, and that we do make a distinction by Asham between Lishmo and Shalo Lishmo. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Lach Rav Huna will say to you, Hacha b'mayaskin, and here what are we talking about? Kagon shehifrish shtei ashamos la'achrayis. He had this obligation to bring a carbon asham, and he separated two animals, and that way he'd for sure have an animal available to fulfill his responsibility. The chad minayu mei kara ola. One of those animals, really from the outset, is a carbon ola. And Rashi explains, Neima te'ave tiyuvte de Rav Huna, let's say it's a refutation of Rav Huna. Midchiyaser Rav Dimi kida amrun deleka leukme bizmano, midakashle tani levi adatana bar levoy. Again, Rav Dimi had this contradiction between Levi and between the Brisa of Bar Levoy, and he therefore said that we're talking about Mechusar Zman in both Brisas, and he gave the answer of the distinction between Lishmo and Shalo Lishmo. That seems to be against Rav Huna. It's like Rav Chilkiah, and Rav Huna will answer, Hachav Mayaskin on the Mechusar Zman Chayev Shalo Lishmo. Here, what are we talking about? Where it is talking about Mechusar Zman, but you could have a case of liability Shalo Lishmo, even though in general that wouldn't be true. But Kegon Shehivrish Shnei Ashamos La'achrayis. The case is that he separated two animals for the responsibility, the obligation of the Asham. Shem Yovad Ha'echad Yischaper B'Sheni, the idea being if one animal gets lost, he'll use the second. V'shachat Echad Mehema B'chutz Kodem Zmano L'Shem Ola. Again, it's Mechusar Zman. He slaughters one of them outside the Beis HaMikdash before the proper time as an Ola. Now, in this case, even though in general we would say Shalo Lishmo, there's no liability, here there would be. Because in this case, Kevan Desofo L'Re'iyah Koi, since in the end it is going to be left to graze, the Asham Shekipru Ba'olav Roeh, because that's the halacha. If you have an Asham where the owner already got atonement, so the other animal is just left to graze, V'dom of L'Ketz HaMizbeach, and then you just sell the animal when it develops a blemish, and you use the money for carbon olas on the Mizbeach in the summertime, so the Mizbeach won't be bottle. Shei Ola, so essentially it's an Ola, Chazi L'Duchte B'fnim, Yishachid L'Gufe L'Ola, so therefore it is considered to be Chazi L'Fnim, it is considered to be fit for being brought inside of the Beis HaMikdash. The gears of the Shinui Neschos is Chazi Lidikavase B'fnim. It would be similar, it would be fit if it would be brought along the same lines in the Beis HaMikdash if it itself was slaughtered as an Ola. And so in this case, Rav Huna would admit, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Tezvav Amid Beis.